My name is Kyle Parks. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs for the Kelmer-Nickel Foundation in Wilmington, Delaware. I'm introducing Timothy Grieve-Carlson. Dr. Grieve-Carlson is an assistant professor and in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. His Ph.D. in Religious Studies from Rice University, Texas in 2022, and he was also a 2021-2022 fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Focuses on the relationship between environmental phenomena and religious practice. His book, American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in Early Pennsylvania, forthcoming from Oxford University Press, explores environmental knowledge and apocalyptic thought in the religion of the early modern mid-Atlantic world. His academic writing has appeared in journals like American Religion, Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, Correspondences, a journal of esotericism and magic, ritual, and witchcraft. He will be presenting his talk, God is Not or Is in the Stars, Religion Change in the 17th-Century Delaware Valley. Let's welcome Dr. Grieve-Carlson to the stage here.
Good morning, everyone. I am now the only thing standing between you and your lunch. Sincerely, my profound gratitude to the organizers of this conference and to all of you for gathering here and listening to me today. I'm just going to dive into my talk. In 1702, a German colonist and religious radical named Daniel Faulkner published a long report on the colony of Pennsylvania for his fellow pietists back home in Germany. It was titled, Curious News from Pennsylvania, and it contained detailed answers to the kinds of questions that ordinary Europeans might want to know before they embarked on such a consequential trip. Among the many queries on subjects like the behavior of rattlesnakes, life among the Quakers, and good relations with sailors during the journey was perhaps the most important question. How is the climate constituted there in the summer and the winter? Not coincidentally, 1702 was roughly the end of the Little Ice Age and the culmination of the bitterly cold and catastrophic winters of the final decades of the 17th century. Agricultural production had tumbled disastrously between 1687 and 1701 in much of Northern Europe as average temperatures declined by nearly 2 degrees Celsius. Throughout Europe and the rest of the Northern Hemisphere, regions that were already suffering from the reverberating effects of the 30 Years' War and the conflicts that followed, apocalyptic famine was the norm by the end of the century. For Daniel Faulkner, who was born in 1666, this all must have been perfectly normal. War, famine, and climate change were permanent fixtures in Faulkner's life in a cosmos that had been visibly declining for as long as he could remember. Faulkner's answer to the question of climate in early Pennsylvania is intriguing, if ultimately vague. The climate is almost the same as here, meaning Northern Europe, he writes, although it is more subtle and penetrating. Faulkner, who was a trained theologian, lapsed from colloquial German into his educated Latin in his use of the words subtle and penetrant. He wanted to emphasize these qualities, and in this learned shift to Latin, he actually marks them as being special, alien qualities of the Pennsylvania climate. Educated Germans reserved their Latin for descriptions of things that had no German equivalent, things so strange that everyday vernacular was insufficient. In so many words, Faulkner is telling his readers that the climate in Pennsylvania is weird. The weather in Pennsylvania was perhaps more unpredictable, fickle, and we might infer that it was more consequential to human health and agricultural endeavors. The Little Ice Age was wrapping up in 1702, but Faulkner had no way of knowing that he was living through the conclusion of a climate epoch that began centuries before he or anyone that he knew was born. At the end of the Little Ice Age, the climate in Pennsylvania struck Daniel Faulkner as more subtle and penetrating than the conditions in Europe, the same conditions that led to what Brian Fagan called the apocalyptic famines of the 17th century. My talk today explores the ways in which religion and climate change influenced colonial and indigenous concepts of landscape and environment in the 17th century Delaware Valley. Far from being an incidental factor or a cultural tablecloth against which the people of early America understood their climate, what we call religion today was often the basic interpretive mechanism in which people, both indigenous and colonist, understood the landscape, their daily weather and long-term climate, their overall environment, and the non-human communities that they shared it with. For Faulkner and his radical religious colleagues, the cosmos itself was a legible text in which an ultimate intelligence was constantly communicating. When Faulkner answered the question of how is the climate constituted for his friends in Germany, he was not making small talk about the weather. At the climax of the Little Ice Age, the climate demanded constant religious attention, engagement, and interpretation. Faulkner was a German pietist who fled the continent for Pennsylvania, probably, I think, under some kind of direct threat of imprisonment or execution, with a crew of equally radical colleagues in 1693. Like many other radical Protestant movements of the late 17th century, Faulkner's Protestant Christianity was riddled with elements of Hermeticism, an ancient body of religious and philosophical literature which became stunningly popular in the early modern period. As scholars like W.R. Ward and Brett Granger have pointed out, 17th century radical Protestants were deeply influenced by the vitalism and cosmotheism. This is kind of a fancy religious studies phrase for the belief that God is actively present in the world, this world, cosmotheism, depicted in Hermetic literature and the alchemical and astrological literatures that derived from it. In my forthcoming book, American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius, I argue that Hermetic literature erupted in popularity during the 17th century in places like what is now Pennsylvania, precisely because it offered Protestants a religious perspective on their changing climate that Lutheran Orthodoxy often simply failed to offer. But Daniel Faulkner was far from the only resident of the Delaware Valley to interpret his climate in religious terms. I want to focus on this region today because it was, as we will see, it offers a relatively prolonged period of interaction and intellectual exchange between the indigenous inhabitants, the Lenape, and European colonists. It also offers a unique variety of European perspectives, from the Orthodox Lutheranism of the earliest Swedish colonists, the pagan-inflected Christianity of their Finnish settlers, to the radical Hermetic Protestantism of the later German colonists after Lenape-Hoking was settled by English and Germans in what became Pennsylvania. In my time today, I hope to show how the landscape of the 17th century Delaware Valley, for many of the people who inhabited it, was thoroughly supernatural and largely interpreted and understood in religious and spiritual terms. The 17th century was the peak of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of severe global cooling in the Northern Hemisphere, which began roughly around 1300 and persisted until its climax at the very end of the 17th century. While historians have understood that periods of severe weather and changes in climate have prompted political and social upheaval, developments in climate science have only recently allowed for clear measurements of climate data throughout history. Today, sources like ice core data, tree ring data, oral histories, read alongside more traditional historical sources, have enabled historians to much more clearly understand the way that large-scale changes in climate have affected the people and the periods that we study. Alongside the global drop in temperature, the 17th century was marked by other environmental phenomena that climate historians are still working to understand. Global seismic activity spiked during this period, and the Northern Hemisphere experienced a succession of seismic events, including earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Some of these events were so massive that they projected enough sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to dim the sun in the northern skies for decades. Celestial phenomena like meteors, comets, and eclipses also increased dramatically during this period. Taken together, these environmental phenomena would have presented an urgent interpretive challenge to any religious worldview. Many of the recent historical studies of the Little Ice Age have been admittedly Eurocentric, given both the severity of climate change in the Northern Hemisphere and the area focuses of professional historians. Recent work in early American history has demonstrated the central role of climate change during the Little Ice Age throughout the colonial period. Perhaps the most comprehensive example is Daniel Richter's Before the Revolution, which reads the early history of North America as a period of continent-wide transition from the medieval warm period and the large-scale agricultural indigenous societies that it supported into the Little Ice Age of early modernity, in which the combined pressures of colonial incursion, epidemic, and climate change devastated the indigenous societies of the Americas as Europeans moved in. More recently, in a 2017 book called A Cold Welcome, The Little Ice Age and Europe's Encounter with North America, Sam White shows how Spanish, French, and English expeditions were repeatedly thwarted throughout the earliest phase of their colonial endeavors by disastrous and prolonged cold weather. Although written sources from the 17th century are less plentiful than later periods in American history, 18th century sources show an often startlingly clear recollection of the climate of the previous century. Anya Zilberstein's book, A Temperate Empire, Making Climate Change in Early America, collects a range of sources that show the climate had warmed so significantly during the 18th century that naturalists from the period, like Samuel Williams, believed that settlers must have actually improved the climate itself. Looking over 150 years of weather reports from North America, Williams could only include that, quote, the whole earth is less subject to extreme cold than it was formerly, and that every climate is becoming more temperate and uniform and equal, and that this will continue to be the case so long as diligence, industry, and agriculture shall mark the conduct of mankind. Williams believed that colonial agricultural efforts had actually improved the climate of North America. Another 18th century source, the physician Hugh Williamson, speaking to an audience at the American Philosophical Society, noted that most of the elderly residents of Pennsylvania had described, quote, a very observable change of climate, namely that our winters are not so intensely cold, nor are summers so disagreeably warm as they have been 4 to 5 decades ago, end quote. Around the same time, in Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson noted that the climate of North America had, quote, become much more moderate within the memory of even the middle-aged, end quote. By the end of the 18th century, the subtle and penetrating environment described by Daniel Faulkner seemed to have moderated considerably, and the cultural apparatus for interpreting this change, at least in the elite circles of people like Williams and Jefferson, had shifted firmly towards something like science. While 18th century sources can help us understand the memory of the Little Ice Age in North America, direct evidence of extreme weather and severe climate change abounds in Delaware Valley sources from the 17th century. Swedish colonial sources preserve anecdotal descriptions of some of the most extreme weather events during the peak of the Little Ice Age. In 1657, Thomas Campanius Holm writes, the river Delaware, as I have been informed, was entirely frozen up in one night so that a deer could run across it, which, as the Indians relate, had not happened within the memory of man. Weather events in the Delaware Valley at the height of the Little Ice Age were so extreme that even the long memories of Lenape oral historians could offer no comparison. These conditions prompted some of the very first systematic colonial observations of weather in the American colonies. In 1644, Johannes Campanius Holm, a Swedish Lutheran minister who arrived in North America on the shores of the Delaware in 1643, described powerful storms that, quote, came suddenly with a dark blue cloud and tore up oaks that had a girt of 3 fathoms, end quote. In 1959, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service created the John Campanius Holm Award, shown here, apologies to these men whose heads I cut off, as a method of selecting and rewarding observers for excellence in observing, recording, and reporting weather data. Holm retains the namesake of this award as the first known person, and I'm quoting the National Weather Service here, the first known person to take weather observations in the American colonies. The namesake of the prestigious Holm Award is both a testament, I think, to the intensity of climate phenomena observed by Swedish colonists in the Delaware Valley, and, I think, a fairly glaring omission of the millennia of environmental knowledge and close climate observation undertaken by the Lenape in the region. The Lenape are an Algonquin people who, during the 17th century, inhabited a territory that ranged along the coast of the mid-Atlantic from what is now Long Island to the Atlantic coast of what is now Delaware, including what is now the watersheds of the Delaware and Hudson rivers. Throughout the 17th century, the Lenape endured colonial incursions into their territory, particularly the Dutch in and around what is now New York, and the Swedes in and around what is now the Delaware Valley. As scholars like Gene Soderlund have demonstrated, the Lenape inhabited major watersheds between indigenous centers of power, like the Iroquois to the north and the Susquehannock to their immediate west. In this somewhat precarious geopolitical position, the Lenape maintained a sophisticated system of diplomacy which was, in general, successful at avoiding violent conflict with their neighbors. This was particularly significant for the colonial history of the region because, as David Hackett Fisher in particular has pointed out, the Lenape were able to manage repeated colonial incursions into their territory with mostly nonviolent means for more than a century, in contrast to the protracted conflicts in places like New England and Virginia. Lenape understandings of landscape and what we might call Lenape spiritual belief and practice were thoroughly intertwined. Again, in her 2015 book, Lenape Country, Gene Soderlund describes 17th century Lenape religion as a kind of sense of the spiritual at home in the natural world. The Lenape saw themselves as one of many intelligent beings in an animate spiritual landscape. Spirits could be felt in plants, animals, rocks, or clouds, a spiritual ecosystem in which human beings were just a part, not the masters. Spiritual beings, or Manitou as the Lenape called them, were interactive presences in the environment. They could be interpreted, communicated with directly, and even called upon for aid. Young Lenape people could embark on vision quests deep in the forest, going for days without food or sleep, wherein, if they were successful, a Manitou might approach them and become a lifelong companion. In addition to the spiritual beings that inhabited and animated the living world around them, the Lenape believed in an all-powerful creator deity, a being who held the cosmos and maintained it, but rarely interacted with human beings directly. The Lenape also made use of shamans or spiritual professionals who were trained in techniques for interacting with Manitou or other spirits. As Soderlund writes, these specialized spiritual workers could be called upon to heal the sick and treat the wounded, interpret the meaning and the symbolism in dreams, both predict and occasionally actively bring about desirable weather, and predict the future. At the end of the 17th century, Daniel Faulkner, the German pietist who we met at the beginning of this talk, describes one night when a Lenape visitor approached him and his companions, explaining to them a method for predicting cold weather. The Lenape visitor came to me and my companions at night in the woods, Faulkner writes, as we were around the fire. He looked at the polar star and observed therefrom that it would be cold, as the star was so bright, which did indeed come to pass. This kind of environmental observation likely did not rely on any shamanic training. Even as late as 1702, colonists from Europe were often reliant on indigenous environmental knowledge in the Delaware Valley. Faulkner's account goes on to suggest even richer conversations on environmental phenomena with the Lenape. In response to a question regarding the Lenape observation of extraordinary environmental phenomena, Faulkner responds, "Yes, this I infer from accounts of former times." Faulkner had apparently been in conversation with Lenape oral historians who could describe to him some of the extraordinary natural, celestial, and seismic phenomena of the Little Ice Age. They know ex stella polari, he writes, slipping back into his Latin, and aliis sideribus. Roughly, they can read the sky from the North Star and the other stars, and they can foretell storms. Daniel Faulkner is just one example of a 17th century colonist in the Delaware Valley who was able to learn extensively from the environmental knowledge of the Lenape. in part, perhaps, because his own religious understanding of his cosmos, while drastically different in the particulars, shared a fundamental understanding of the world, the environment, as a source of spiritual insight and knowledge. The deep understanding of the Lenape and of the landscape and their place in it is suggested throughout oral and written Lenape sources that historians can access today. The danger of winter ice and cold is personified in several Lenape oral histories in the story of Snowboy. Several sources describe the miraculous birth of a child who, if mistreated, afflicts the extremities of other children with frostbite. Snowboy eventually identifies himself to the people and asks his mother to leave him on an ice floe. "My name is Snow and Ice," he said. He said he had been sent by those above to show them how to track anything, people or animals, and he told them how to do it. "When I come again," he said, "you can track anything. Remember when snow falls that it is I who come to visit you." Then he told his mother to take him down and put him on a piece of ice, to go down the river, for it was early spring. Then he drifted away down the river. Snow and Ice departs for the north, but he returns each year as a communicative presence in which the Lenape can engage with the dangerous forces of winter for their own mutual benefit. Until recent years, the Delaware would go down to the river with a little bark vessel of kahamakun as an offering to the Snowboy. When a large piece of ice appeared, they would give 2 or 3 whoops, and the ice would swing in towards the shore. Then they put the little bark boat on the ice and talk to Snowboy. They tell him that they are glad to see him again and to take this corn with him. Then they ask him to help them in tracking game. In this story of Snowboy, we can see how the Lenape may have handled some of the challenges of life in the Delaware Valley during the Little Ice Age. Recognition and regard for environmental forces as communicative and intelligent presences in their own right, shown proper courtesy and respect with ceremonial offerings, turns the danger of ice and snow into a welcome homecoming. As the Lenape oral historians recount, when Snowboy returns, they tell him they are glad to see him again. Even, we might imagine, when Snowboy freezes the river so solid in 1657 that herds of deer can walk right across. What a convenient way to leave fresh deer tracks for the hunters of a people living through a brutal winter. The 18th century Swedish naturalist Per Kalm preserves one account of a citizen of former New Sweden which does a great deal, I think, to introduce and elucidate some of the major differences between indigenous North American and colonial European attitudes towards non-humans in general during the 17th century. Kalm was a Swedish-Finnish naturalist and explorer who was commissioned by the Royal Academy of Sciences in 1747 to travel to the British colonies in North America to bring back seeds that might be useful for Swedish agricultural endeavors. Writing in 1749, Kalm described a visit with Niels Gustafsson, the old Swede as he called him. Quote, "The father of this old man had been one of the Swedes who were sent over from Sweden in order to cultivate and inhabit this country," Kalm reports. Gustafsson was 91 years old when they spoke. This would have made him a relative latecomer to New Sweden as a boy, but still someone who had lived in the Delaware Valley throughout the 17th century. Gustafsson was evidently one of the many colonists of New Sweden who remained in the Delaware Valley long after Sweden had abandoned its colonial ambitions in Lenape country. Gustafsson was very young when he left Europe for North America, and his memory of the landscape was long. Quote, "He still remembered to have seen a great forest on the spot where Philadelphia now stands," Kalm writes. There's already a bit of selective memory at work here with Kalm's informant. Nearly a century before Kalm met with Gustafsson, the Swedish geographer Peter Lindström noted a particular concentration of Lenape settlements around the area where the Schuylkill meets the Delaware. There were, quote, 6 different places settled under 6 sachems at the site where the rivers converge, Lindström wrote, a total population reckoned being several hundred men strong under each chief, counting women and men. To be fair, both of these accounts are likely accurate. Lenape communities did not deforest their immediate environs in any significant way, and their use of regular prescribed burns and brush clearing enabled the old growth to persist and grow even more impressive. The expansive forest that Gustafson remembered on the site of Philadelphia was, in fact, carefully maintained and cared for by the people who lived there, a fact that Gustafson likely did not know. Gustafson went on to provide Kalm with details on the Swedes' use of herbs, livestock, and their reliance on the Lenape for help through the difficult winters in the 17th century. But as Kalm's narrative goes on, it becomes clear that this reliance did not forge anything like a mutual respect, at least for Gustafson. As to their religion, Kalm writes, the old man thought it very trifling and even believed that they had none at all, Kalm reports, a startling claim by an old man who had evidently lived alongside the Lenape for decades. When they heard loud claps of thunder, they said that the evil spirit was angry. Some of them said that they believed in a God who lives in heaven, Kalm admitted, a strange thing to acknowledge of a people just after one has claimed that they have no religion at all. Gustafson was evidently not the most inquisitive interlocutor on the subject of Lenape spirituality. Kalm goes on. The old Swede had once walked with an Indian, and they met with a red-spotted snake on the road. The old man therefore went to seek a stick in order to kill the snake, but the Indian begged that he would not touch it because he adored it. Perhaps the Swede would not have killed it, but on hearing that it was the Indian's deity, he took a stick and killed it in the presence of the Indian, saying, "Because thou believest in it, I think myself obliged to kill it." As Kalm relates, Gustafson provides more than a clue here as to why he found himself uninformed about Lenape's spiritual belief and practice. The very notion that the Lenape he walked alongside saw the snake as a being with a kind of moral status, or at least something that did not need to be killed thoughtlessly for no reason, seems to irritate Gustafson to the point of personal insult. Because thou believest in it, I think myself obliged to kill it. Reading Kalm relate this story, we are left wondering what exactly Gustafson's Lenape companion must have said to elicit such a reaction, to convince Gustafson that the snake was something like a deity and to drive him to such senseless violence. To conclude, throughout the extreme climate conditions of the 17th century, the Delaware Valley was the site of extended cultural encounters in which the meaning of the non-human landscape was subject to diverse cultural interpretation, sometimes in conflict, but often in surprising agreement. By the end of the 17th century, and across the Delaware River in West Jersey, an English Quaker colonist named Daniel Leeds was writing some of the very first popular printed material that appeared in Pennsylvania. Leeds was a farmer who relied, in large part, on some of the detailed Lenape celestial knowledge that I have described so far in preparing the astrological charts that his planting schedules depended on under the unfamiliar skies of the Delaware Valley. One book of Leeds that survives today is a 1688 compilation of a German mystic named Jakob Böhme for an English foreign American audience, with commentary by Leeds, entitled The Temple of Wisdom for the Little World. In his commentary, Leeds asserted that he inhabits a cosmos imbued with divinity. If you can demonstrate that God is not in the stars, Leeds writes, then I will recall and recant all whatsoever I have written. Leeds' rhetorical point here is clear. God is in the cosmos. In the 17th century Delaware Valley, during the height of the Little Ice Age, sustained cultural encounter and shared environmental knowledge contributed to a common notion of an abundantly supernatural landscape. Thank you.